Hello and welcome to another edition of the X's and O's with Greg Cosell. That guy over there is my buddy Greg Cosell of NFL Films and ESPN's NFL Matchup. I'm Doug Farrar of SMG, USA Today Sports Media Group, and Touchdown Wire. And Greg, we've had a couple weeks now with the draft. We talked last week about our favorite players coming out of the draft. We've had some time to sort of sit down and go, okay, what are the best scheme fits? Who are the players taken, coaches and executives decided, hey, we want this guy for this thing. And I went through some transcripts and videos and got some really interesting comments from the those people on these NFL teams for whom these draft picks, and it's everywhere from first round to third day, are just exceptionally good scheme fits for their new NFL teams. And before we get into these players in a general sense, when you're looking for scheme fits, do you sort of search for it when you're watching tape and analyzing and talking to people, or does it have to sort of come to you, if that question makes sense?
Well, I think when I watch a player, and I think you probably do the same, you always start with what he is, given his traits and his attributes. You and I are a little different in this from teams in the sense that we can't do the same due diligence that teams do in terms of research, background, all the things that sometimes present red flags or sometimes don't. So essentially, you and I are watching tape. And obviously, that's a significant part of the process, but there's other things that go into it. But when I watch a player, since I can't get involved in all those other things, I'm not necessarily thinking as I'm watching about specific NFL teams. I'm thinking about how I see the player best deployed in the league. And
Right.
then every once in a while, a team will pop into my head and think, oh, okay, yeah, I'm watching this particular defensive player. And, oh, yeah, I know this coach's system pretty well. He would fit there. Or I'll see a player and think, well, I think his best usage is, not his hand in the dirt, but he's got to stand up and maybe you can move him around. You think those things just sort of pop into your head as you watch a player. But I never go into it with the idea of, oh, I'm going to see how this guy fits with a specific team. That just sort
Right.
of jumps out. Same with comparisons, as we've talked about
Right.
before. You don't go in thinking, who am I going to think this guy is like? Someone either pops into your head or not. And as we've discussed with comparisons, Doug, there are multiple ways to do comparisons. One is to compare a player to another player when at the same point in their careers. In other words, when that player came out of college, not what he is in the NFL. Then there's other comparisons where you think of what a player is in the NFL, and then that college player reminds you of that. So there's multiple ways to look at things, and nothing is 100%. There's so many variables involved in all of this. And at this time of year, I'm not sure a lot of people think of it in those terms. They think of it as, black and white. They think of it as a mathematical equation.
Yeah. Well, as we discussed before, there are two kinds of evaluation when you do this. There's pre-draft in a vacuum. This player is this to me based on what I've seen. I'm looking at metrics and
Right.
whatever. And then the second part of the evaluation obviously is, okay, this player has been drafted by this team. How does this work? And I think that's what we're kind of spinning forward here.
Yeah. And then you start to think, if you know enough about the coaches, and again, some we do, some we don't,
Yeah.
you start to think, well, they drafted this guy. Why did they draft him, and how do they see him within the context of what you know about the coach? I mean, and coaches evolve too. But in that case, you do the best you can, and sometimes it works, and sometimes it doesn't.
Yeah. But you obviously want your player to have a head start with a favorable scheme. Jayden Daniels going second overall to the Washington Commanders. And you said something interesting about Daniels. We were talking in the abstract about him a few weeks ago. You said that he would be best suited for an offense that sort of spread things out. Would you like to go? Because Cliff Kingsbury, who's Washington's OC, was not always married to spread concepts. I mean, when he got the job in Arizona in 2019, they ran 10 personnel 32% of the time, which is like, what? By the end of his time in Arizona, they were an 11 and 12 personnel team. He had really changed the sort of schematic imprint of that passing game, but he did still spread it out. So before I get into my argument that Jayden Daniels is a good scheme fit with Cliff Kingsbury, what are your thoughts about that marriage?
Well, I think Kingsbury, when he was in Arizona, played to his personnel. They did not have great receivers.
No.
They did not have, I'm sure even 3 wide receivers that he felt great about. So I think he ended up playing to his personnel. Because they had Zach Ertz, they ended up with McBride and Ertz for a year or two there, I believe.
Which,
Certainly
by
for
the
a
way, is
year,
what
maybe
coaches are
two.
supposed to do. You don't want to imagine something you don't have.
Right. So I think what ultimately he did, which was correct in my view anyway, was to play to what his personnel was. My sense is, given his background, that he probably liked to be a little more spread. Now, the NFL is a little different than college, as we know, but my sense is he would like to probably spread. I think with Daniels, you're dealing, and I think this is true with a lot of young quarterbacks, but certainly Daniels, in the sense that he does give you a run game element.
Mhm.
So you want to be able to have that element. Now, you can run your quarterback in multiple ways. Clearly, you look at what the Ravens did with Lamar Jackson, where they tightened everything up and they played with multiple tight ends. They played with Patrick Ricard, who essentially was a sixth or seventh offensive lineman,
Yeah,
and was not even though he's technically an eligible receiver, was not even used that way. So there's multiple ways to have a run game with a quarterback that can run. Um, I don't think that Cliff Kingsbury is thinking along those lines at all. There will be a run game element with Daniels simply because he is so dynamic, but I don't think he will think of it in the same way Greg Roman did. I think he will think of it more in terms of zone reads, spreading it out, creating space. Because Daniels is straight line explosive.
right.
And you want to get him on a straight line. You don't want to get him having to weave and wade through traffic. And plus, he
Right.
doesn't have that big a body in
No,
terms
you
of
don't
just.
want him taking it, and he's got a problem with taking those Wile E. Coyote hits anyway. He's going to
Yeah,
have
and
to
I
take
think he'll
that.
settle down with that. But the other factor too, when you spread it out a bit, is and they do have receivers in which they could do that. I I think you help the quarterback pre-snap in what he's looking at, because when you do spread it out, the defense tends to have to declare a little more. Now,
Yeah,
defenses have become smarter too. It's not, years ago there were certain things we said that were said as platitudes, and those things, just years ago we'd say, well, if you go in motion and someone runs with them, it's man coverage. Something like that is not necessarily true anymore. Same thing with just spreading it out. Everybody says, well, the defense declares. Sometimes yes, sometimes no. These defensive coaches, they adjust, and everything is cyclical as well.
well, these days, defense, and we've talked about this until we're blue in the face. Defenses declare pre-snap; they declare something else post-snap more than ever. So they declare
Correct.
what? What are they
Correct,
declaring?
but you still, what you want to my way of thinking anyway, for whatever it's worth, what you want to do with someone like Daniels is you do want to give him the opportunity to be able to research and understand the defense as much as possible
Sure.
before the snap of the ball. And I think you can do that better with spreading it out more, as opposed to having everything closed in. Now, there's a lot of really good offenses that do have a lot of cut splits, reduced splits, tight splits. We know the Rams do that. We know the Niners do that. But in the case of Daniels, I think it makes more sense to me anyway to go the other direction.
Yeah. Well, with in Arizona, they ran a lot of QB draws with Kyler Murray, and I was getting into this last season. Daniels had 12 quarterback draw runs. He got plays of 12, 14, 17, 27, 35, and 40 yards out of them. That the QB draw game was one way he was explosive as a runner. So it'll be interesting. And I would agree with the spread out because he's such. I mean, I got to watch tape with him the day before he won the Heisman, and we talked half the time about his fade balls, which are just exceptional. So he's not a guy who needs cut splits. He's not a guy who necessarily needs receivers to scheme themselves open, to the boundary. He's going to make those throws.
No, and you make a great point about the fade balls, because there are a lot of slot fades. So if
Yep.
you spread it out and you have a slot receiver, and that slot corner is, let's say, a team wants to blitz and attack, and they want to use the slot corner as part of their pressure, that's something when you're a little more spread out that you can see clearly pre-snap. And he does have to kind of show it a little bit, or else he's coming from a lot of distance, depending, and particularly if your slot is to the field and not to the boundary, which is 99% of the time the case. So, I think there's ways you're what every coach wants to do really are two things, and again, not only two things, obviously, but, you
Hopefully
know,
not. You want more
Yeah,
than
I don't want to say it as if that's all they're trying to do. Um, you're trying to give your quarterback as much information as possible before the snap of the ball. That's what you're really trying to do. That's one of the main things. Now, as you said, defenses know that. So what defenses have done in response is they've changed the look from pre to post. But depending on the offensive formation and where receivers are aligned, we get into that concept of receiver distribution and location. Sometimes you can make it harder for the defense to do that. So I think you are trying to do that. And then the other thing you're trying to get done with your quarterback happens sometimes, can't happen all the time, is to be able to throw to his primary read,
yeah.
because you're making your play calls based on your anticipation of what the defense is going to be given the down and distance situation, the personnel on the field on both sides of the ball, and other factors as well. But every coach would love their quarterback to be able to throw to the primary read.
And the thing about Daniels, and you've said, I know in your scouting report for the 33rd team, you said that the nuances of the position are important to Daniels. And this is a guy who, I mean, and because he's so mobile, I guess some people undercook the fact that he is really good with progressions in the pocket. He had a passer rating from the pocket of 144.0. No other NCAA quarterback had a better passer rating from the pocket than he did. So before you rush to judge him as a runaround guy just because he's an athletic freak, there's more on the ball here than you might have recognized. The play we're going to put up from Daniels, he had a 23-yard touchdown to Brian Thomas Jr., who we'll also discuss in a minute, versus Texas A&M, where Daniels went through his progressions, pumped the ball to Kyron Lacey on the post to keep the safety away, and threw the fade to Thomas. And that sort of fake made me think of Ben Roethlisberger in the pocket, where he would do that a lot, and other quarterbacks have as well. But this is a guy who, from the pocket, can do a lot of things, and it's not just first read. He can go through progressions. He can hit the open guy. And he really improved on this last season, and I think that tells you that he can even take that further in the NFL.
For sure. And I think as dynamic a runner as he is, I never got the sense watching his tape. I mean, there's always an exception here or there, obviously, but I never got the sense that he dropped back with the idea that he was going to pull the ball down and run.
Unless it was a design run, no. He really
Right,
didn't.
right. I mean, he definitely dropped back, tried to work through progressions. Sure, every quarterback that has great running ability or can make plays outside of structure, there are going to be plays in which they move prematurely. That happens. That happens with great quarterbacks. Patrick Mahomes does that a lot. Josh Allen does that a lot because they're capable of doing that and still making great plays. Of course, Daniels will do that on occasion, but that's not the way he plays the position. He doesn't drop back just to look to drop the ball down and run.
Nope.
He drops back with the idea that I'm going to work progressions and throw the football.
Adam Peters, the Commanders' new GM, who came from San Francisco, made the point, and it's you look at Kingsbury's resume. I mean, he said Cliff has had a lot of athletic quarterbacks. He had Mahomes at Texas Tech. He had Kyler Murray in Arizona. He was USC's senior offensive analyst, so he worked with Caleb Williams. And Peters said, "Yeah, Cliff has such a history with those athletic quarterbacks and how to round it all out that he and Daniels are, of course, discussing that already." So when he said they're vibing, and I'm highly interested to see what that vibing looks like on the field.
Yeah, no, he'll be the starting quarterback barring anything unforeseen. So we'll see
Oh yeah.
how that plays out. But that's an intriguing mix of Kingsbury and Daniels.
Another intriguing mix is both Bo Nix and Troy Franklin, his favorite receiver at Oregon, to the Denver Broncos. We could go another 15 minutes on why that's a good fit, but you've mentioned, and I agree. I mean, you and I got to watch tape with Bo for about half an hour, and we know how smart he is. When you look at Bo Nix in what you perceive to be the ideal Sean Payton passing game, what is that passing game, and how, in your mind, does Nix best fit it?
Well, to me, I always felt, and again, Sean Payton did have Drew Brees essentially for all of his career. So,
Right.
I think that we know what he did with Drew Brees, and that's the only thing we really have. And
Right.
Drew Brees being 6 feet, not with a power arm, it was a very rhythmic timing pass game. And Brees we know about his work ethic and his approach to the game, and everything was precise. I mean, there was probably very few quarterbacks, if any, that played the position with sort of the precision of Breeze, and that's the way he practiced. So that's the way Sean Payton, has been in the league for years and years and years, and he knows it's successful. And to me, that's when I watched Bo Nix at Oregon. That's the kind of quarterback I saw. I thought he was a ball distributor. He was an efficient executor. Of course, a lot of people say, well, there were a lot of RPOs, and that's okay. But the point is, he understood the timing and rhythm of the pass game, and he got the ball out. And he
He
got
also
the
had
ball out to the right
explosive. Yeah,
receiver.
he also had 58 explosive passes last season. So
Right, right. And does he have a power arm? No, he doesn't have a power arm, and neither did Drew Brees. Now, again, this is not a direct comparison. We're talking stylistically, because
right,
Brees will be a first ballot Hall of Famer, no question. So we're talking just stylistically of the approach you want to take, the concepts within your pass game. So the way Knicks played fits the way Sean Payton sees the quarterback position.
mm-hmm.
That's what we're talking about. We're not saying Bo Nix is Drew Brees. We don't know what Bo Nix will be. I mean, before the draft, I mean, this goes back because I always do the quarterbacks first because that's the position I get asked about. So maybe it was in mid-February when I made in my notes that I thought that Drew Brees would be the kind of quarterback that would fit a Sean Payton offense. And again, I had no idea that's the way the draft would play out. But I think stylistically, that's what I saw. That's the kind of quarterbacks Bo Nix is. He's not a sit in the pocket, sit on his back foot, wait late in the down, and drive the ball 30 yards down the field. That's not who he is. He's a timing rhythm player who throws with good accuracy, good ball placement, and moves the chains, and has enough mobility and athleticism where he can make some plays. The stats about deeper, the explosive plays. Those you always have to look at those plays. Obviously, you and I can't remember them all. Obviously, some are deep throws, some are not. But I just think stylistically it fits.
Well, the play we'll put up here is and we put this play up when we watched tape with Bo, was that throwback against Oregon State where he got out of the pocket and Franklin got loose, and it was sort of a scramble drill, but it showed not only Nix's ability to create outside of structure, but also his connection with Franklin. Those guys just had kind of a mind meld. So I also find, and when Payton talked about, after the pick, Payton talked about Nix's attributes, he spent very little time about the physical stuff. He said he's so smart.
Right. Which we sort of saw when we did the half hour, 40 minutes with him. He knew everything. I mean, and he called the protections. I mean, he knew everything.
Payton mentioned that. Payton said, we gave all these quarterbacks we met with the test, and Bo just aced it. And you could tell he was in there, all night, pot of coffee, like grinding away. So with Payton, and I'm, not that it's amplified by what happened with Russell Wilson last year. Payton's been doing this for a long time. He has his standards and what he wants. But I think that was certainly an example of what he didn't want. And with Nix, I think it's more on the ball. And then getting Franklin later in the draft, and his quote on Franklin was...
Whose quote? Sean's?
Sean's on Troy Franklin. We see him as an outside Z. He has really good speed. We were really impressed with the line of scrimmage. We also had the combine, and even at Bo's private workout when he was there, we probably had a little bit more exposure. That was a lot more coincidence to that. That's just how the drafts unfold sometimes. But they wanted Nix to have the receiver he most trusted in that. You don't usually get that, but in this case they did. What are your thoughts on Franklin and how that all works?
Yeah, I mean, that'll be interesting. He obviously was drafted later because he was viewed, as a vertical dimension, and not as a whole lot more right now. We'll see how he develops. I think it's interesting, that he's a Z. His height would indicate that maybe he could be an X, but he's not. He only weighs 176 pounds or somewhere right around there.
6'3", and he was drafted in the 4th round.
Right. So, I think the Z part and maybe even the slot where depending on formation, the slot can be pressed, but often it's not. Maybe early on in his career, He's kind of, for those who remember the Saints back a number of years, maybe earlier in his career, he's a Devery Henderson type player for Sean Payton. Henderson would catch 35 balls but average 17 or 18 yards a catch and kind of be used as a vertical dimension on specific packages. My guess is Franklin is not going to be ready to be a full volume receiver early in his career in the context of a complete offense, but he does have a vertical dimension. There's no question he can run.
And it's, and Nick's gets, as he's trying to digest a massive playbook and a highly effective playbook over time, he has a guy he knows and can trust, and that probably helps. This was one of the tighter scheme fits to me that I've seen in a while. It was Blake Corum from Michigan to the Rams. Last year, and we discussed this in season, the Rams went from a lot of inside and outside zone to heavy man stuff. Wham and duo alone, the Rams last year gained 510 yards and 284 yards after contact and scored 8 touchdowns on 115 carries. The Patriots ranked second with 82 carries. So the Rams really planted their flag in more of a man blocking ideal. And then when you look at backs in this draft with the most success in those concepts, Corum had the most. He ran more out of wham and do than anyone else. 276 yards, 81 yards after contact, 3 touchdowns on 38 carries. Audric Estime, who went to the Broncos in the 5th round, ranked second with 27 carries. Troy's Kimani Vidal, who I'll talk about in a minute, went to the Chargers. He had 24. But this to me was, and they already had Kyren Williams, the Rams did, who fits in that scheme. And McVay said, we're not replacing one guy with another. We're just sort of doubling down on this new philosophy we have.
Well, my sense is the philosophy resulted from the back, not just, hey, a random change in philosophy.
Oh, no.
Right. Because Kyren Williams is not a great zone runner. That's not his game. Because Kyren Williams is not really an explosive one-cut runner. So, I think they made the change because Kyren Williams became their back. And right. Kyren Williams obviously had a really good season. Corum is, to me, it's funny you say that because, again, I made that comparison when I watched Corum, that I thought he was somewhat similar to Kyren Williams. Because Corum, I thought, was a really good runner in terms of the details and nuances of running. Understanding gap fluidity, understanding defensive flow, the things that, because backs have to understand all that. Yep. It might be intuitive and it might be instinctive. They're not mapping it out like an equation as they're running, but I think he had a very good innate feel for that. He just wasn't an explosive back, and neither is Kyren Williams. So in some ways you could argue that they're similar. So, as you said, they probably saw all this and they felt like, okay, this is now our run game. We do have our quote unquote feature back in Kyren Williams, and he's a smaller guy, so we don't know if he makes it through a 17-game schedule. So now we want someone who, in a sense, can do the same thing.
Yeah. So maybe last year it was, we have this back, let's do this scheme. Now it's like, well, we have these backs and this scheme is going to be the feature. Now maybe it's more intense schematically. I don't know.
Right. You play to what your talent is. And, obviously Kyren Williams is not Todd Gurley.
No. And the play will put up the 59-yard run against Washington in the national championship game where Corum read the man blocking, slipped through the gap, and got active at the second and third levels. He does have some straight ahead juice. He's not a burner by any means.
No, he's not. That's not going to be his game in the league at all.
But when you watch the Rams and you watch what Corum, I mean, like I said, just from the metrics and from the play style, this scheme fit for me when I was putting these together. This was the easiest one because it's like, oh yeah, duh. This is pretty clear what they're trying to do here. The next one, Dave Canales is the new head coach of the Carolina Panthers, Buccaneers OC last year. And I find it interesting, Rachaad White had the second most carries in the NFL last year behind only Christian McCaffrey. And McCaffrey, of course, went all the way to the Super Bowl. So he's used to using one running back, Canales is. And when the Panthers selected Texas running back Jonathon Brooks, Canales said, our system calls for a back that can be used, of course, in a traditional way, hand it to him. Then how can we get this player in space? Being able to get him in perimeter screens and checkdowns. We have a really cool empty packages where we use the backs, flex them out to get matchup, things like that. of Brooks. Canales also said he's a bigger back. He's got range. There's so much he brings from a versatility standpoint. That's probably the biggest thing that stood out. And then just vision, patience, contact balance, acceleration. Like he's got it all. He's the best back in this class. So it's not just the praise, it's the we want this guy again to do these things. And he had a 73-yard screen against TCU where he just kind of blew. He is a more explosive back. So your thoughts on what Canales said there, kind of what Canales did in Tampa Bay that we could maybe spin forward to what he'll do in Carolina, and how you think Brooks fits into that? Because Canales was extremely specific about what he wants Brooks to do.
Well, I think he wants his back to be a weapon,
Yeah.
to use the term that, Brad Holmes used a year ago with Gibbs,
Mm-hmm.
Jameer Gibbs in Detroit.
Yep.
I think he wants his back to be a weapon in addition to being a running back. And Brooks is obviously a very good running back. He's kind of silky smooth. He's explosive as a pure runner. And you can debate who's the best running back in the class. Maybe that's what they felt, and it could turn out to be so. But I think, he wanted a guy that if he were to get the ball to him in space, and he's used to Rachaad White, who, was a great receiver as well at ASU when he came
Yep.
out. That was one of his really positive traits in addition to being a back. I think he wants his back to be that kind of player. Now, obviously, for whatever reason, Miles Sanders did not work in Carolina. Miles Sanders was theoretically that kind of back in Philadelphia, and a previous staff in Carolina obviously thought he could do that there, but didn't work out. So Dave Canales wants a back that is more than just let's hand him the ball 18 times. He wants him to be able to be in a situation where he can have variations with his formation. He mentioned the empty package. That was, as you said, very specific to mention that. So
Mm-hmm.
he's going to use him in that way, just as he used Rachaad White. So that's how he envisions Brooks. Brooks was not a true receiver at Texas in the sense of running, the same kind of routes that White had run in college. So we'll see how that all plays out. They obviously feel, and again, this is where they do more due diligence than we can. They probably had him in for a personal visit. Maybe they went and had a private workout with him. They did all those things that made them believe that Brooks can do all those things in the context of their offense.
What I found interesting about Brooks is when I went back and looked at him after what Canales said, he actually lined up either outside or in the slot on 5% of his snaps, but all of his catches, and I believe he had 28 targets last year, all of them were from the backfield. So
Right,
Canales
right.
also saw where he was lined up.
So I'm sure in their private workout, they saw that, hey, this guy can catch the ball and this guy can run, quote unquote, receiver routes. I'm sure they did all that. He is an explosive player. He's very silky smooth, and he's 216 pounds. So,
Yeah.
He's not a small back, just like Rachaad White is not a small back either. So in some ways, Canales was looking for that same kind of player. And in his mind, that's what they drafted.
Yep. Two guys for the Chargers. We'll start with Lad McConkey and then go to Kimani Vidal, the running back. We've talked about McConkey a lot. Just your thoughts. I mean, your thoughts about how McConkey fits in what certainly Jim Harbaugh wants to do. Also, OC Greg Roman. And it's interesting that it was Harbaugh talked about his competitiveness and his ability to gain extra yards and gain grimy yards. And he actually compared him to Brock Bowers with the way he gets yards after the catch. And the play we'll put up is he had a 22-yard catch. McConkey had a 22-yard catch against Florida State with a quick stop route as Bowers ran up the seam to clear the defense out. McConkey broke 2 tackles to get his 16 yards after the catch. So we've talked about the route awareness, the vertical ability, but when Joe Horitz, the GM, and Jim Harbaugh talk about the competitiveness, that play comes to mind for me. And it's really, they both, Horitz and Harbaugh, really pinned in on the competitiveness and just the grit he has.
Yeah, I mean, I got to be honest. I'm not sure what this offense is going to look like
I
because
don't either.
we know that Jim Harbaugh wants to run the ball. That's a significant part. He drafted Joe Alt with the 5th pick in the draft. He wants to make sure the offensive line is really good. We know that.
I got to talk to him, just to break in. I got to talk to Harbaugh for about 15 minutes during Super Bowl week. And when I brought up Justin Herbert, he mentioned the word protection about 5 different times. So, there you go.
Yeah, no, we know the way he sees the game, but the question is now that he has Greg Roman, how is he going to run the ball? And I'm not sure about that. So, it's hard for me to get a feel for exactly how McConkey is going to be deployed, because McConkey is not necessarily a split out wide, beat press coverage kind of receiver, not at this point in his career. So, I don't have a great feel for that, to be honest with you. I mean, I love McConkey, as you know.
I do too.
And given who he is and what he is as a player, I don't think he has a weakness given what he is. But what he's not is, let's split him outside the numbers. He's not at boundary X.
No.
He's not that guy. So I don't have a great feel. I mean, look, they know all this about McConkey. What I'm saying is not something they don't know. So I'm just not exactly sure within the context of what this offense is going to look like, which, as I said, I don't know. I'm not sure exactly what they see or how they deploy him, but he's going to play because he's one of their three receivers.
I think his position is a guy who gets open. Well, they have Josh Palmer. They have Quentin Johnson, of course, who they drafted in the first round last year. We're still kind of waiting for – they just signed DJ Chark. So I think they're still kind of building it.
Yeah.
We know with Roman, his time in Baltimore, it was heavy gap scheme, and he likes those smaller or shorter, powerful backs. They have a couple of those guys from Baltimore. And Kimani Vidal from Troy, he had more forced missed tackles and more yards after contact than any back in this class, and just about more than any back in the NCAA. And the play I want to put up from Vidal is 36-yard touchdown run against Appalachian State, where he bounced outside the scrum and got upfield quickly with speed, and also the power to break tackles. One thing I liked about him, and I really liked him a lot, he runs with great ability to readjust his body for contact balance. I don't think he's going to be the quote-unquote feature back. I think they will use a rotation. But as I mentioned before, Vidal did a lot of really good stuff in different gap and man schemes. And unless Roman pulls a reverse Sean McVay and goes completely into inside and outside zone, I think that's going to be a really interesting fit for him.
Yeah. See, he's one of those guys. I mean, he was a 6th-round pick. We have no idea because, see, the player that with the Chargers that I think will end up dictating Vidal is J.K. Dobbins.
Yep.
Because if J.K. Dobbins is healthy and can play, he's going to be the number 1 back, and Edwards is going to be the number 2 back, and Vidal would be a once-in-a-while player.
Right.
Now, if Dobbins
and both of Dobbins and Edwards both came from Baltimore, so there you go.
Correct. And so if Dobbins can't go, I mean, if he's, for whatever reason, he's unfortunately fought so many injuries in his career, but he's a really good back. He was, and we don't know where he stands now, but let's assume he's okay. Then I think you'll see Dobbins and Edwards get the bulk of the work. And Vidal, I think they would have to figure out, and we don't know the answer to that. They'd have to figure out what that means for him.
I think they allowed him with a late pick to load up on another guy who fits what they want to do, which, and you never know how these things, a lot of 6th-round picks have come up and done some pretty interesting things. One kind of obvious scheme fit, I want to get into the nuances of it. Xavier Worthy to the Chiefs. We know, ever since they traded Tyreek Hill, the Chiefs' downfield passing game has been an adventure, to say the least. It certainly was last year. Worthy running a 4.2 140. The play I want to talk about here is 30-yard catch against Iowa State, where he got free underneath as Adonai Mitchell ran a deep crosser. When Mitchell spun his route inside 15 yards upfield, that allowed Worthy to have free space to accelerate underneath. We know that Worthy can be a danger in a straight line, but he also has he's run a lot of different route concepts in Steve Sarkisian's offense to get open, and I think the Chiefs will have a lot of interesting plans to sort of help him with that. He's not just going to be a straight line burner.
No, I would agree. I mean, they run a ton of motion. There's a lot of formation variation. Their receivers line up all over the formation. The feeling is Rashee Rice will be suspended, so it'll be Worthy and Brown, 2 guys that can run. Then we'll see who their third is. Obviously, they still have Kelsey. So, I would expect Worthy to be used in multiple ways in the context of that offense. He's not going to line up in one place. They're going to try to get him free access off the ball. They're going to try to get him screaming at the defense with that speed. And I think you'll see more of a vertical game this year with Brown and with Worthy.
You could see more of that short burst motion I envisioned that the Dolphins use. And of course, Jordan Rodriguez of The Athletic wrote that great article about it. And I found it interesting. Dane Brugler, also The Athletic, in his huge The Beast draft preview, which is must read every year, that Worthy really got into Texas as his school because he was impressed with how Steve Sarkisian prepared Devontae Smith for the NFL when Sarkisian was Alabama's OC. You're obviously familiar with Devontae Smith from, because you're close to the Eagles and all that. What are your thoughts about how that deployment? Because you hear Tyreek Hill, you hear all these different shorter, faster guys. What are your thoughts on that? Just the ways in which Sarkisian got Devontae Smith ready for the NFL. Are there similarities you see to how he's hopefully, in Worthy's case, prepared Worthy for the rigors of the next level?
Well, I would say that's probably very fair because I don't know if you've ever done this. I have. I've watched on YouTube clinics by Sarkisian with his pass game, and his pass game is very. I don't want to say it's NFL based, but I mean there's many concepts and combinations that are you see in the NFL all the time. So that's he's not one of those just spread it out and throw tunnel screens and let's just run RPOs. He does much more than that. So when you play for Sarkisian, you're exposed to a lot of route concepts and combinations that are very prevalent in the NFL. So that makes perfect sense. And actually, his clinics are really fun to watch.
Yeah, he's a brilliant guy.
Yeah.
One guy I want to get into real quickly before we go, Brian Thomas Jr. with the Jaguars, 23rd overall pick. It's funny because, Malik Neighbors was this, just amazing receiver at LSU. I'm not going to say that teams were quote unquote sleeping on him. I don't know that he was talked about as much as I would have liked in a general sense. I think because they lost Calvin Ridley to the Titans in free agency, obviously, and everyone's freaking out over, well, what are they going to do? I think they got a really good guy. And the play I want to put up is Thomas's 41-yard catch against Florida, where he was the front side ISO on the other side of bunch, beat cornerback Jason Marshall Jr. off the line with foot movement against cover 3. Thomas then ran by Marshall and safety Bryce Thornton, who was shading to Thomas's side. Excuse me. This is the kind of play that tells me that Thomas can be utilized to a point as an ex-ISO guy. He wasn't talked a lot as such because he was in an offense with Neighbors, but both Trent Baalke and Doug Peterson talked about Thomas's ability to win at the top of the route, and you see a lot of that with him.
Yeah, I mean, I thought Thomas would be an ascending player, that there's still much room for growth. Obviously, he can run and he can get on top of the secondary. I thought he did, need some work overall. It'll be interesting as a first-year player because he's going to play. I mean, right now, their 3 receivers are Thomas, Kirk, and Gabe Davis.
Yep.
So he's going to play, and he's going to play early. So the question is, how do they see him right now? I mean, they really don't have an X. He's almost going to have to be their X. I don't personally view Gabe Davis as an X. Maybe they do. But I think ultimately he's going to be their X receiver. We'll see if he can do that right from the start. But there's no question that he can get on top of the secondary. I think there's a lot there with Thomas. The question is how quickly it all comes together.
Yeah, creeping death on going seam routes, nice build-up speed, then whammo, he's gone. Extensive library of foot fakes, both at the line of scrimmage and when open space. He knows how to get open. He leans in and out of his routes to create openings, leverages his routes to coverage, great at slow playing the cornerback off the line of scrimmage before turning on the jets.
I think it's so interesting talking about receivers because, I talked to a good number of coaches, and boy, are they – I mean, these are veteran coaches, and boy, are they all over the board when they evaluate receivers. I mean, and these are guys who've been in the league a long time, so their opinions are or their interpretations. I hate to use the word opinion. Their interpretations of how they evaluate players are totally valid. These are guys, and no one's right all the time, and no one's wrong all the time. But you talk to coaches, and God, they are so different in their evaluation of this receiver class.
Yep. Yeah, but he'll face a crap ton more press coverage than he did in college. Drops show up on tape, could be an issue at the next level. What I wrote is I love Thomas as a complimentary speed target. I'm not sure if he's ready to be a true WR1 just yet. That X, maybe he isn't, and maybe To close this week's pod with the receiver distribution and location, with motion, is it as important as it has been in previous years to have that XISO guy? Do you need that as much as you have? Do you need that as much as you have needed it in previous eras where you weren't doing the tight splits, you weren't doing the motions, you weren't, as you said, screaming guys off the line to get them open? There are so many ways to get guys open. Do you need that dominant guy as much as you have
I
in?
think you'd get different answers from different coaches.
Yeah,
Because I've spoken to coaches who say that it's really hard to have a really good pass game without an XISO receiver, and then other coaches who say, we can scheme all that. So, I think that again, it's a classic case of there's no one answer and there's no right answer. But there's no question that a number of coaches I've spoken to believe that it's really difficult to have a consistent pass game. Look, there's 3-by-1 sets are a staple in the National Football League.
yep,
And in 3-by-1, you have a single receiver to the short side of the field, to the boundary side. That's why we call him the boundary X. Now, the way the league has evolved coverage-wise, that boundary X receiver very, very often gets man-to-man coverage. In some ways, he gets zero man, because a lot of times, even if a team is playing two deep safeties, that deep safety to that boundary side is often focused looking at the trip side and
right.
dealing with that.
He's shading the trips or bunch.
Yeah, right. So now you need a receiver, that boundary X, that can win 1-on-1. And as we said, 3-by-1 sets are so prevalent in the league. So yes, can you do motions and all that? The X receiver is on the line of scrimmage. He's not a motion receiver. Right. So at some point you do need a boundary X who can win versus man coverage. And that's important in the context of an offense.
Sure.
Is it the only thing? Of course not. But you do need that at some point.
Yep. Well, Greg, you're our boundary X every week. We always appreciate the insight and knowledge and understanding of the game. And we'll be back next week to do the best scheme fits on defense, which I love that. It's just a lot of fun stuff going on. So, as always, Greg, thank you so much. And we'll talk again next week.
Thanks, Doug.